Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beyond the Books, The Language of Success, an interdisciplinary podcast on child and adult literacy. Today, we have with us June Akers, a children's author who addresses learning skills in an entertaining way in her Riley Madison series. June has been a teacher for over 20 years, and in this part of the podcast, we will be addressing ADHD. This is actually the latter part of a 45-minute video, but the part which addresses more directly the ins and outs of ADHD and literacy. I hope you enjoy it. Literacy is like that. It's just so important because here you've got these little kids and they're done in before they get going. There are probably a lot of or teaching schools, schools for teachers, education
Mhm.
degrees, where they're really not being taught how to diagnose and take care of all this. Sometimes that's kind of left to like special education, but
Mhm.
somebody's got to find that out when they're really little, not when they're
Yes,
18. You know?
right. Yeah, and you are so right. I was not taught to see that in children. Like when you're working with kids, you'll start seeing, oh, this kid seems to continue to write the letters backwards longer than they should, or they keep reading the words in the wrong order, and then you kind of notice stuff. So I think sometimes they take it, they're just like, oh, you'll figure that out. You'll notice a difference. But you are so right. I think that would have been amazing to have a class that says, hey, this is what you want to look for. This is, when these little ones
Right.
start doing this is what you want to look for. And, and then there's a lot of stuff, just like most jobs, you learn while you're on the job. You
Right.
learn because I had mentor teachers and I would talk to them and they'd be like, oh, that is a classic sign of this or this or this. But at the
Right.
same time, I would have been a better teacher if I had already been prepared and knew what to look
Right.
for sure. And it might be really hard for. And that's the thing about, diagnosing people with ADHD. There are different levels of it. There are some people that really struggle more with this, or there are some people that, hey, I actually can do this really well, but I got this going on, which is another reason why it's really hard to diagnose sometimes, because again, there's different levels, and the thing about the ADHD is they're more severe than what the average person deals with. And that's one of the ways, oh, okay, they're struggling more than the typical kid with
Right.
this. And this is, this is kind of abnormal. So then that's some of the ways, okay, something's going on. This is getting to be really difficult for this child, and it shouldn't be this hard, or should, and that's some of the ways that you can find what's, can figure out, okay, they might have ADHD. But also it's one of the most misdiagnosed as well, because sometimes they're just children, and children
Yeah.
are active and in and but also ADHD, it's not just these hyperactive kids. I was a little girl that I wasn't hyperactive. Like, I would sit there and I would daydream, and because I have a very creative mind, so I would just sit there and
That's why you're a writer.
daydream, just right. And so anyways, it is a very difficult thing sometimes to know for sure, oh, do you have this or do you not? And so sometimes, going back to learning skills, sometimes just if you're not really high off the charts with some of the things, or you have, just learning the skills can put you back on track where you don't necessarily have to have the medicine, and that was my daughter's story through elementary school. I will say, once we got into middle school, her world got turned upside down. It was way overstimulating for her, because when our kids go to middle school, they have, I think, 8 different subjects. They have a
Oh, yeah.
locker. They have to keep up with everything. They
Right.
have to be in their class in 3 minutes. And of course, she had her strategies and stuff that I she and I had worked on, but she was still struggling. She was
It's hard for
completely
anybody.
overwhelmed.
7th grade was the worst grade on earth.
And so that is actually where I realized, okay, this girl's got skills, but she was so overwhelmed. The anxiety was coming on, and she wasn't even enjoying school anymore because she was like, Mom, I'm trying, but I just can't keep up. And that is actually when we started exploring the medicines and seeing, okay, will these help her? Like, will this help her kind of get her focus? And and she needed it then. So I wanted to like tag on to that because you and I had talked before we did this about how important literacy is. And, one of the things that you see in children that have ADHD, because they can't focus very well, um, they don't often hear all of the lesson. And so you will start seeing those children who like start daydreaming during the reading lesson, and those are your little ones that are like, okay, come on, let's pay attention. And you have to do that to a lot of children again, but you will again, ADHD you find when for me as a teacher, I found it when it was extreme, when I was
Yeah.
like, okay, this little one can't just regroup and let's get focused again. This one is a constant,
And
all right, come
and
on
then what
buddy.
happens? And
Yeah.
then if you have teachers who do not know this stuff, they just say the kid is bad.
But they have learned to teach these children now. Like we've learned how, okay, they need a brain break. We're going to get the wiggles out. You don't just sit and learn all day. Like
Right.
we're moving, and we're learning how to teach these children, and we're learning how, okay, they get overwhelmed when you give them a whole, maybe if they're in first grade, they might get overwhelmed with reading 4 paragraphs at a time or something. And so you say, okay, you know what, bud, you're just going to read 1 paragraph right now for me. And we call that the chunky monkey, where you're like chunking it so they can handle it, because they
Mm.
sometimes get overwhelmed with all this stuff. So we really have learned so much how to really teach these children and meet them where they are. And so that is such a wonderful thing. But we didn't know in the past, and
Oh,
sometimes there's still teachers, and sad to say, sometimes they're the ones that maybe aren't as willing to change with the times, and like, this is how I teach, and these
right.
kids have got to learn to, focus and blah 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 blah. And they do need to focus, but the thing, I know we're here to talk about the literacy, but if they miss that, if you don't figure out how to educate them, how to get their attention, how to get them to learn their letters. I mean, I had one little guy so in love with Batman. So I had Batman visit our class, and he learned letters with Batman, like flying, like what
Yeah.
do they love? What gets their attention? And so, then if they don't learn how to read, if they don't learn those letters, I think you have a lot of the information about, like, you had mentioned that by 4th grade, if they don't really learn how to read, it's
Yeah.
devastating what the kids, like that just not doing well in school. The dropout rate it skyrockets if they don't
20% right
learn.
now. 20%.
And
That is
actually,
disgusting.
there are different reasons for why children can't read. Parents, they're from another country. They're trying to learn 2 languages, because when they're little bitty, they're being spoken to at home by one language, and they're being
Right.
spoken to at school by another. And then their little brain is learning vocabulary in 2 different languages. And, so definitely we can see that as causing, a barrier for actually learning how to read. I actually experienced this as a 7th grade teacher. The school was integrating some new concepts of how to teach reading, and the method was like, oh my goodness, I'm going blank, of a whole language. Anyways, basically, if you see the word, they took out the phonics. And if you see the word, you're just going to use your comprehension of what you're reading to figure out, like, if the word was computer. And so you're reading about, like, the man sat down and was typing on his, and it starts with a C. So they would guess, they basically are guessing it's a computer. It starts with a C. And so they were taking out the phonics. And so these children were like the trial group with this type of learning.
Oh,
And when they got to me in seventh grade, they had no phonics and they could not read because like comprehension is get comes a comprehension comes later. You have to actually learn the words in order to
all
get
right.
the
We always
comprehension,
had to sound now. What did sound
right?
out the word?
Phonics is a huge deal. And so when I started teaching seventh grade reading, it was actually my very first job. I was 21, and the man that hired me, the principal was like, I need you to like take them back to elementary. I need them to know letters. I need them to know their sounds. The phonics is they've got to learn the phonics. And I'll be honest, most of those children were the kids that they weren't doing well in any subject because if you can't read, yeah, it
Yeah.
affects every subject.
And then you start adding math and calculus. And
Right?
I mean, it's hard enough if you can't read. Well, maybe I don't know. Does that if can you learn math without being able to read?
You actually can, but when you get to the word problems, that is a lot that kills them, and a lot of times they excel in math, because it's not reading, it's numbers, and so they get numbers, but then when you get to the word problems, they just and a lot of times they'll just be like, or they'll guess because they'll see the numbers and they'll be like, okay, well, I think we're doing this type, and so I'm gonna just take these numbers, and yeah, so you'll see a lot of guessing, but eventually it catches up with them. So it just affects every area of their life, which is why reading is so important.
And
We
because we
gotta get
write
these
books
kids
and need to
reading.
sell them, so somebody's got to read.
Right. Yes. And that's the cool thing about you want to have lots of books around your kids. Like just having those books even when they're little, reading through picture books, like that's how they start loving reading. Books are special. And I remember one of my favorite things is my mom, she didn't always have time to sit down and read with me. So we had the little cassette players and she would buy me books with the cassette players. You get them at the library and I would play the cassette player and I would read along, looking at the words while
Yes.
I was looking at the story. And that is a big deal. Like you're learning, when you're just reading, it is expanding your vocabulary. You're learning how to spell. You're actually working on learning how even to write because you look at how people are writing. Like there's just so much stuff from reading. And it's definitely like I don't like giving out homework, but I always my homework every night is, hey, I just want you to read. Go
I
home
think
and read.
I
Read, read,
think
read.
one of the reasons that nobody ever had to tell me to read, and I don't remember ever being read to. I think we had a book of fairy tales, but I didn't have children's books for the most part.
Mm,
But I had to work in my grandfather's grocery store, and he had Zane Grey and some other Western books, or
mhm,
the newspaper. We had the Denver Post every day, and there was absolutely nothing for me to do if I didn't read. So my reading levels shot way out. That was the way I entertained myself. I spent hours and hours alone as a child.
mm,
So therefore, I read, and it stimulated my imagination. I can remember that I was very sick as a kid, so that's another reason I spent a lot of time alone because I was in the hospital a lot.
oh,
And I remember that my grandfather had little books, and they were what's the name of that book? Where the guy stuck Crusoe, which is a hard book to read because it's in older English, if you're a
mm,
child.
mhm,
And they were in these teeny tiny, each chapter was in one little book, it was like 2 inches by 2 inches. And I sat there and read those. And I found that after you got the hang of the language, being so different, it was very hard to get started, but then it became natural.
mhm.
And I didn't even notice it.
Yeah, that's actually kind of how reading is. It's hard for kids sometimes at first. And and there are those kids that man, they just pick it up so
Yeah.
fast. They just, whenever teaching reading is actually really difficult because there's always these exceptions to the rules. And so I would have some kids, my daughter for one was like, oh, that is so cool. And because it was different, she would remember it. And then you have
Right.
these other little kids that they got those black and white brains where it's either this way or the other. And they would get so frustrated when, well, wait, that's not the rule, and just all
Yeah.
these exceptions. And a lot of times those children actually really struggle with reading because those little rule followers, are like, it just really bugs them, but
Yeah.
again, the more they read, the more they get the stories in front of them, and that's where the comprehension starts coming in. And even though there's these exceptions to the rules, they are comprehending and they're realizing the word and they're sounding it out and making it all fit. And I'll just be honest, I did not like reading. I really struggled with all the sounds, and I missed a lot of some of my early years. I was absent a lot, and um because I had some stomach issues and things we were trying to figure out with an allergy. And so I actually missed a lot of some of the reading skills. And I actually was one of those kids, like the black and white. Like I was like,
Yeah.
no, this is how it's supposed to be. But then I did not really even enjoy reading. And I was even in those like the I was in the low reading classes always. And then I got in sixth grade and I found books that I loved and I couldn't put books down. And then from that time on, I just shot up in reading. I was not
Maybe
in the
you
low
just didn't
reading.
like kids' books.
Maybe, I don't know.
Well, I finally
Yeah.
once I finally got to fourth grade, and I was uh, saying I was all upset that school was going to be out because I couldn't go to the
Mm.
school library. I didn't even know we had a city library.
Oh no, that's terrible.
Yeah, so I went there, and so the in fourth grade I read every Nancy Drew and
Yes.
and
Yeah.
what was the boy
Yeah.
series? I can't remember what the name of that, but it was Nancy Drew, and then there was a
The
boy.
Hardy Boys. The
Yes,
Hardy
yes,
Boys.
yes.
Yeah, that's a good
I
one.
read every one of those too. I
Oh,
wasn't
that's
as good
awesome.
as Nancy Drew, but
Yeah.
because who wants to
Oh,
read about boys? Yeah.
yeah. I
I
love
changed
it.
my tune
Yeah.
later. By seventh grade, I had revised that.
Oh, well, good. That's funny. But yeah, just a big part of learning how to read, of falling in love with reading, is just having books in front of you constantly, because you never know what series, what book is gonna grab. I
I
actually
think is most important thing about teaching and learning is you never ever know what your life is going to be, what you may end up doing. I ended up working in
absolutely.
law firms for years because they most well the higher up law firms usually require a master's degree for a secretary. So because it's you have to be able to work on your own and have a high level of understanding,
Mhm.
and you're dependent. I mean, lawyers depend on you a lot. It's changed a lot since now lawyers do their own typing for the most part, but somebody still has to get those PowerPoints out. And all like I had to make a lot of scientific charts, which is not, they don't mess with that. So there's a lot of, anyway. So, I never thought I did entertain being a writer always, but it was always between music and writing.
Mm,
But you never know what you're going to have to do for a living. You know, it was because I could read so well that I always had well-paying jobs.
that's awesome.
And
Yeah.
then, I was an administrative assistant, and there was only one person that was an administrative assistant that just had a bachelor's
Mm,
out of everybody. Everybody had a master's, and some of them were from Harvard.
wow. Yeah.
So, you know, you and that's just being an administrative assistant. You're not. So,
Mhm.
and people don't realize that. They think that, uh, if you have to work for minimum wage, it's not going to be very pleasant.
Right. And even with minimum wage jobs, you have to know how to read a lot of times, like
Yeah,
you're reading, you're having to follow directions, or you have like, you were
right.
saying we talked before, you went to the doctor, you had to fill out all this stuff. Like, you have to fill out an application, and yeah, it is just, honestly, it's debilitating to people when they can't read. It just is.
Well, let's just say that we'll wrap it up and say that literacy is probably one of the most important things that we need to attain.
Absolutely.
So,
Definitely.
and thank you for coming on. It's been a great,
Yes. Thank you
great
for having
conversation.
me.
Yeah, I hope people will learn a lot from this. I think they will.
I
So,
sure hope so, and get their kids reading and
yes,
excited about reading.
especially middle
Yes.
grade books.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, because you do middle. Yeah, mine are more elementary, but
Yeah.
yes, you gotta yes, just reading books,
Well, so that
constantly
they
reading.
start with yours and then they get to mine.
There we go. Yeah, this sounds good.
All right. Thank you, June. It was lovely having you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us this week. As a special treat, there will be another live podcast next week. It was actually the first part of our 45-minute recording session. In this episode, June Akers and I discuss ADHD, but as both of us are also classical musicians, we address how music is a literacy in itself, which also applies to learning to read and teaching the discipline it takes to learn and do difficult things. Please join us next week on October 31st. Happy Halloween.